Welcome to Art Ed Radio, the podcast for art teachers. This show is produced by the Art of Education, and I'm your host, Andrew McCormick. Today, we're discussing how we as art teachers can fit into the current educational paradigm. Now, you know the one I'm talking about, the big data paradigm. PLCs, common formative assessments, student learning objectives, standardized tests. Everything seems to be about hard, quantifiable data. And this can honestly leave art teachers out in the cold a little bit. But fear not, because in a second, I'm going to bring on my favorite go-to data and assessment guru, Sarah Dougherty, to talk about how we can make data work for us.
Hi, my name is Sarah Dougherty, and I am the Visual Arts Curriculum Coordinator for Des Moines Public Schools.
We're going to talk about how we can make data sexy. And I know that's just kind of a buzzword to attract the eyes and ears of our AOE fans out there. But what I'm really talking about is making data important, fun, and meaningful. In short, making it work for us.
I think using data is important because what else would we use to drive our instruction?
In this episode, we'll tackle the big ideas of what does good, sexy data in an art room look like, what kinds of assessments that we can create and use to create that kind of data and actually use it, and then finally some concrete takeaways to start creating and making that sexy data to drive your curriculum choices, whether you're an island or you're working in a group in a PLC. So let's talk about data. The reality is that accountability and standardization are two pillars of education. We can't ignore data, and it really shouldn't just be a game that we play. We say we look at data, but really it's just a dog and pony show that we put on for our administrators. Oh yeah, we're looking at data, when really we're not. Now I know data should drive our decisions in the classroom, but I think we need to ask the question, what kind of data? What does relevant data look like in the classroom? Now it shouldn't be a one-size-fit-all decree from the school district handed down from on high. It's got to be something that's created by art teachers, for art teachers, that's really meaningful, or we're really just spinning our wheels. It makes no sense to tie my curriculum decisions and program evaluations to standardized math and reading scores. Or, those goofy specific rubrics that say, identify all the vocab words, a big summative post test, or do 7 different types of line. We do so much more than that. So why wouldn't we want our data to reflect this? I think we need fewer rubrics and assessments that are trying to quantify a more qualitative art experience. We all know this game. If you can create 7 values, you get an A, and 6 is a B, and 5 is a C. Or you need 5 different types of line, or show me 7 different types of implied texture. I think people glom onto these ideas because there's numbers involved. It's easy to slip this sort of thing into a rubric and some ways look legitimate to our administrators. But like I said, we do so much more than this, so wouldn't we want our data to reflect this? We need to create rubrics, and may I even say alternative assessments like portfolio or self-assessments that reflect the depth and breadth of the real work that we're doing. I think the number of lines a student creates is far less interesting and applicable than an assessment that can give feedback to students about their critical thought, creativity, and collaboration. To me, it seems like a no-brainer that we would want to create these rubrics that reflect a more open-ended national core art standards and 21st century skills set. I mean, if you look at those things, they are very open-ended. Why are then we trying to pigeonhole ourselves into sort of this quantitative box? Creating assessments that hit these standards isn't, all foo-foo-y and hippy-dippy. I mean, you can still describe what mastery, emerging mastery, proficiency looks like. And wouldn't this data, and I know that this language is starting to flirt with standards-based grading, which is another concept near and dear to my heart. Wouldn't this data be more relevant and more sexy? Wouldn't you like that data to help guide you versus some hocus pocus of standardized test scores? So if you're as into data and assessment as I am, make sure you check out AOE's online course, Showing Student Growth in Art. Whether you're looking for a lane change or need some grad credits or even some PD hours, I think you'll really enjoy this course. As with all AOE courses, you'll get a chance with Showing Student Growth to get reflective with your practice, create a number of new tools that will take your teaching to the next level. Showing student growth is a 2-credit class, and it begins at the beginning of every month. So learn more by going to theartofed.com and clicking on the Courses tab. So now let's bring on my good friend, Sarah Dougherty. All right, Sarah, welcome to the show. So we are talking sexy data, making it work for us. And
That's
you
right.
are my go-to data guru. So I want to start off by playing devil's advocate here. Why should I really give a crap about sexy data? I mean, can I just keep doing the same old dog and pony show that I've been doing for years?
I think you can do that, but you shouldn't, because how do you know that same old dog and pony show is working for our kids? And to know that requires a little bit of measurement. And, measurement is kind of like a dirty word sometimes in the art room, but it absolutely doesn't have to be. But it's so important that we just don't keep doing something for the sake of doing it. It's important to use a little data and assess not just kids' work, but our own work, so we know that what we're doing is meaningful and relevant for kids. And we know that kids are learning, because that's our primary job.
Right. So if we do the same old dog and pony show, I mean, we're kind of relying on our best guesses and hunches and assumptions, but we really don't know, if we're doing it right or doing it well.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, you've convinced me that I should make it work for me, but I mean, that's easier said than done, right? So
Right.
can you give me some specific examples of some teachers out there that are making sexy data and making it work for them, or maybe some stuff that you've done?
Yeah, I think the teachers that I have seen and work with that are using it best are finding ways for kids to own the data, for kids to track their progress over time, to use goal setting. That's sort of different from the our thoughts around data in the past, like having a multiple choice question and answer sheet, and then kind of dividing kids into like the red and the yellow and the green. That's the stuff that turns people off. But what's really exciting is when we see kids looking at their kind of scores over time and setting goals, saying, like, I'm at a 2, but I know I need to do these 3 things to get a 3. Or for teachers to be able to use that data to have conversations with kids about what they need to do and where to go next, rather than that kind of, and I've used this phrase before because I love it so much, rather than the autopsy, using like having like a
Mm.
monitor for the heartbeat of the learning and the artwork that's happening in your room. And you, as a kind of like the clinician of the art room, want to monitor that heartbeat to make sure that things are healthy, that things are robust. You don't want to wait until there's a flat line and figure out what went wrong. So
Right.
kind of using that to, and making on the spot decisions, I think, is really important. So that kind of goes back to that whole not waiting till the end piece,
Yeah,
looking
and
at that data.
I really like that analogy, and I've said that to my kids before, and I've said it to my parents. The sort of the big clunky, it doesn't really work for us rubric at the end, which is summative. It really is like an autopsy, and the
Mhm.
kids are done and they're checked out and they're ready to move on. They're not going to change anything or learn anything, and that's where I think some formative assessments along the way, some rubrics, some really authentic things that we can create. So we've kind of talked off mic a little bit about how our assessments and our data looks different from other teachers. So specifically, I mean, can you say what those sort of things look like? Is it just a better rubric, or what is like a different assessment tool that gets us better data?
I think a better rubric is absolutely the case. Sometimes we look at rubrics, which are great ways to get a little data and to measure student progress, but we make them super like quantified, right? Like I'm thinking about a little kid who can do 5 lines and then 7 lines, and they move up the rubric by just adding more lines or demonstrating more of something, which is not really showing a whole lot of growth. Same for like a secondary example, like a kid who can make a composition touch 3 sides of the paper. Oops, you touched 2 sides of the paper. I'm going to give you a lower grade. So I think that's where we have kind of a disconnect. That doesn't really tell us very much about learning. And so it doesn't the data from that doesn't make sense for us. So in order
Right.
to get data that makes sense, that helps us drive instruction or help students make decisions, the tool by which we glean that data has got to be smarter. And I think the rubric is terrific. And I think that there are other content areas kind of wisening up to that. But the rubric has got to be about developmental skills. So, right, the foundational skills. I have the foundations. I know the vocabulary. I can do a little application, and then the next part up on the next move up on the scale in the rubric would be I can do that and I can apply it and make inferences, and then like going beyond. So I think it is a lot about creating better tools with which to measure and then collect the data.
Right. And I think it's got to look a little bit different because, it can't just be here's a project, here's a rubric, moving on. Here's a project, here's a rubric, moving on. It's kind of
Right.
like, I think of it this way, that we have these big essential skills or these goals or these learning objectives. And really your projects are multiple data points. You could say, I scored, the student, the artist out of this on this project, and here's why. And now
Yeah.
on a different project, same skill, it's a this, and here's why. So the data really does look different, and you have to maybe explain a little bit, and maybe that becomes self-assessments, maybe that
Hmm.
becomes multiple sort of check-in points on a portfolio.
Right.
So that this kind of segues into one of the things that I think is so important about data, which is working with the PLC. And that's something that's near and dear to my heart. And I know you've talked about it before at some of the AOE conferences, is making your PLC work. And, it's really a no-brainer, like-minded teachers teaching the same thing, sharing best practices. But data is such a huge part of that. And like you said earlier, sometimes we as art teachers get a little bit turned off to data because it
Hmm.
seems like not relevant to us. So can you describe to us what a really high achieving art PLC looks like when they're creating and using their data?
Yeah, first, I think it's all about establishing a climate and culture where you can call people out and have real conversations. I think
Mm-hmm.
if we, especially those of us who have, and I don't, it's not true just of elementary teachers, but it's especially true, I find, in elementary buildings. People are afraid to have critical conversations with each other.
Well,
And I think
we're too nice. I mean,
we are too nice.
no one wants to
And
be mean or anything.
and you know what? And I think it's beyond that we're too nice. I think we are in like the fight for these kids' lives. And if we're not in
Mhm.
it together, and if we can't, like, it feels like if we say something or challenge something that someone does, we're really betraying the only allies we have in this fight. And I think that's a little bit melodramatic, but that's literally what we're doing. We are
Mhm.
preparing kids for lives. And so if we're not in that fight together, and we say something that tick someone else off, there can be a danger of that, a kind of a cultural danger in your school. But if we, first of all, you just got to establish that climate and culture that we're here to do what's best for kids, and what's best for kids is to take a critical look at each other's at our practices and our own practices, and
Mhm.
being open to that. So that's, I think, the first part of a high functioning PLC, is to be able to say, ask questions like, why did you do it that way, or give a suggestion, and
Right.
things like that. I think the other thing that you point out, which is really smart, is using those Rick Dufour questions, and
Mhm.
starting out with, what do we want kids to know and be able to do? And you were talking about how we get really project specific rubrics, and then we
Sure.
can't measure anything over time. You're absolutely
Right.
right. If we have a line item on our rubric that's like applying paint techniques on this project, and then the next project we have one that's like behavior based, following directions, and then on the
Right.
next project we have something else. There's no way to measure progress over time, and we want to give kids multiple opportunities to get better at something. We cannot do one-stop shops. Like, if you didn't get it in this project, sorry, you're never going to get it again. What
Right.
a hopeless message to our kids. So I think
And I've seen some rubrics that just have horrible criteria, and some of this was being sort of a teacher of pre-service teachers. One of them was like, how much did you enjoy the project? Did
right.
it seem like you really enjoyed the project or only kind of enjoyed the project? Number one,
Exactly.
as a teacher, how do you know? I mean, you can guess, but you don't really know. And I actually think this gets to something that came up at a PLC talk just recently that I was having, which is, a high functioning art PLC really needs to take emotion and guesswork and
Hmm.
hunches and beliefs out of it. And we really do need to be data-driven and research-driven.
Absolutely.
You can't just say, well, I like doing this. Yeah, but if the research in the data says that doing this or assessing this isn't the greatest, then we shouldn't be doing it. And if you really
Absolutely.
do think it is the greatest, then let's prove it. Let's see your research, show me the data, and convince me that this is what we need to be doing. So, I don't want I don't want to turn this talk exclusively into PLCs, but I think that data is such a big part of that. And we got to get on the same page and make good data so we're making good choices.
Right. So I think after you have that climate and culture, or I don't think that we don't have the luxury of saying, first we're going to spend a year on climate and culture, then we're going to do work. You got to kind of have to establish these things at the same time. But your second action, or your action right along with that, would be to ask yourself, what do we want kids to know and be able to do? And if you don't have, like, the national standards are terrific, but they're hard to get into, drill all the way down to what kids would be doing to demonstrate that. If you have a whole bunch of rubrics, bring them together and figure out what those common threads are. What am I assessing over and over? And you can distill those down to what's the most important things. And then from there, I think the really concrete step is to develop a general rubric that you can use over and over and over again that would apply to every single project that you're doing. That doesn't mean that you can't have specific, right?
I want that on a t-shirt, because I fight for that all the time. And I think some people kind of push back against that. But like you said, I mean, you got to have a long sample. I mean, you got to have, you have to provide students an opportunity to improve something. And if you don't, in every project, something different, I mean, that's a schizophrenic classroom right there.
Absolutely. Can you imagine if you were, for instance, going to get your driver's license and the exam was over different things every single time? And so, like, how do you know what you're even being?
Right.
And I think that's also a really great step in what, going back to your question about what are good teachers doing, they're not hiding the criteria from kids. So we did this terrific explanation, or this terrific demonstration in one of our PDs, where we had three teachers go up to the front of the stage, and we said, you're going to clap and the rest of the room is going to grade you on it. Well, the people up on the stage had no idea what the criteria were. And even we, as the people who were assessing them, didn't know what the criteria were. And so it was like this big confusion. That's actually often what happens in classrooms, right? Mm-hmm. But once the teachers on stage knew what the criteria were, and the teachers had a clear set of criteria, the acceleration of learning of how to clap and what we were looking for was it was incredible. You could do it right away. So I think making sure not only that you establish that as a PLC, but then you have ways to help kids understand what it is they're learning and what specific steps they need to do to engage with that learning, to get better and to improve. You're going to see just enormous progress in your students when there's clarity and transparency around that.
And that's one of the things, one of my partners in crime at the junior high I teach at, that's one of the things we've been working on is, with our learning management system, making our rubrics the same, making them visible. Because I've been a firm believer in a long time, students can't hit targets if they can't see them, right? So you've got to make them, transparent and visible. And I just think that and maybe that's step one of making data be sexy, is like, we got to make it be visible. We got to agree upon it, and we got to make sure that kids can see it so that they can achieve it so that we can measure it. And I mean, that sounds so simple, but because we're a subjective field, I think a lot of teachers, we can kind of muddy the waters with what we like. And, well, this is really important, but I don't agree this is important. But, you've got to define those steps. So, Sarah, I know we could talk PLCs till the cows come home, but
for sure.
I kind of want to wrap this up on some very concrete, specific things. So, if there's a teacher out there listening to this podcast and they're saying like, man, tell me about it. All I hear all day long from the admins is what's your data tell you, and let data drive your decision. What are 2 or 3 very specific things that you think that teacher could do tomorrow that could start improve, what they're doing and make data sexy for them?
Yeah. Number one, boil it down to 3 to 5 things that your kids need to learn to be successful at the next level, whatever that is. If you teach 4th grade, boil it down. What are 3 to 5 things that kids need to know in 4th grade art so that they can be successful in 5th grade? If you teach an AP class, what are 3 to 5 things they need to know to be successful and pass that AP exam? Once you've boiled that down, I think you create some rubrics that go developmentally through stages, not quantified. And then I think the third thing that you do is you don't forget the most important stakeholder, and you start by communicating with the student about those expectations and having them be a part of their own assessment process. You know, we like to think we're a subjective kind of group. We shouldn't be. We're objectively grading and assessing learning. That doesn't stop us from having opinions about what's good art and what's not good art, but that's not that's not our job. Our job is to assess learning over time.
Oh, that's awesome. And talking about my colleague at the junior high, we've been trying to think about that too. We try to get our students involved with, self-assessment at the end, but what about at the beginning? What
Absolutely.
if we told them, okay, guys, here are the 5 or 6 essential skills we're looking for over the whole year. And in this project that we introduced yesterday, what do you guys think this essential skill looks like in this project? And we're trying to get them to help us actually create the rubric, like at the beginning, so that we have some buy-in. We're still giving them some of the criteria, but we're letting them fill out what quality and what learning and evidence of learning looks like. And it's been a really interesting process.
Yeah, it's a great first step also into a more choice-based classroom. And I think that is almost always more meaningful for both teachers and students. And I have a ton of questions all the time about, but how do I reach standards in a choice-based classroom? Or how do I assess kids in a choice-based classroom? This is the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, hey, you just wormed your way into another podcast episode, the choice-based classroom and assessment. But hey, Sarah, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all your great insights. And I'm sure we'll be in touch with more questions about choice-based and assessments down the road.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. We'll see you later.
Thank you. All right.
Bye. Holy cow, I love Sarah Dougherty. What a trove of knowledge about assessment and data and PLCs. Ultimately, while I know that this show is about sexy data and making it relevant for us, it's also really about better instruction and providing your students with the best, most authentic art experience that we can as teachers. And some of that starts with really authentic feedback. And who wouldn't want that? So my big takeaway, think about what's really big picture important for your students and for your art program. Is it the specific, quantifiable, play the game like everyone else data points and rubrics that we can easily slip into a dog and pony show for our administrators? Or are we trying to show growth and critical thinking and creativity and passion and grit and perseverance and voice? And we can create the assessments that show that, and we can make that data work for us. Those are the things that take a different set of assessment tools, and they're probably going to look different from other teachers in the building, and that's okay. So don't be shy, make it work for you, and make that data sexy. Art Ed Radio is developed, produced, and supported by the Art of Education with audio engineering by Michael Crocker. If you want to support the show and enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe on iTunes. Leave some comments and write a review. We especially appreciate those 5-star reviews. New episodes of Art Ed Radio are released every Tuesday, and additional content can be found under the podcast tab on theartofed.com. Join us next week as we'll be talking about how to streamline your grading practices with technology. Thanks for listening.